So we've been learning about developmental milestones, and we have some words to describe what we're seeing in motor development. This week, we're going to pull back a little bit and look at the perspectives that got us to know and learn and be able to talk the way we do about motor development. So there we go. We want to answer the question, of course, when are we going to use this? Well, we're going to use this to describe various stages of development. We're going to use this to describe movement patterns that we expect to be seen. And we're going to use this to describe this little bitty baby on the left that can't do anything, and this mischievous little guy on the right who is probably really mobile and gets into everything. So we're going to talk about these three different perspectives today: the maturational, the information processing, and the ecological. The maturation is, it suggests that development just happens. It's innate. It's instinct. So this would be the nature argument. It just is what it is. Things are going to happen when they need to happen. The information processing is more of the nurture. Things happen because of experience. And the ecological perspective is there are individual, environmental, and task constraints. And of course, that's what we talked about last week. But again, I want to rewind it back and talk about how these three developed. So the maturational, again, it thought things just happen, specifically in the central nervous system. So these folks thought it didn't matter what you did. A child was going to learn how to walk, talk, whenever it needed to. So at the preset moment, it was going to develop, regardless of education, jumpstart, early intervention programs and services. So clearly, we don't buy into this maturational perspective. And it started with a couple of characteristics I'd like to talk about. One was qualitative. Those are words, words that describe things, and that's the data that they used, as opposed to quantitative data, which didn't happen until much later, where they started taking numbers. We know today that these motor patterns are not discontinuous. We talked about this last week. Reflexes just don't start and stop at a switch. We had somebody in class talk about a little person that they know that learned how to walk and then went back and crawled. And that can't happen if these things are discontinuous. So it's a continuum. You keep learning and developing. So this theory really came from the 1930s with McGraw and others. And they, again, suggested that things are going to happen when they happen. And go ahead and click this link and you will see a twin study to some old-timey music. I'm not going to spend time on this video going through it, but there are some really weird things they did. They had to test reflexes. I'm not going to spoil it, but go ahead, check it out, and you'll understand why bad science gives bad results. And some of these bad results were all associated with the nervous system, but as you see in the video, they're not really even testing the anything neurological at all. They just video recorded people and talked about what they saw. So it was observational in nature. And McGraw said, well, you know, the one twin is doing things faster just because that's the way he's wired. And there are triggers in his brain that haven't hit his twin brother yet. And that's why we see one kid doing a new skill and the other kid behind them. So I put this red up here just to last semester my students they forgot which was real and which was not, which was rejected, which is accepted. So we reject the following. We reject that motor skills emerge automatically. We reject that these skills are influenced by training. We reject that mild deprivation arrested development. And we reject that the nervous system is the only thing that drives these. So this maturational perspective did come a long way since the 1930s. By the 40s and through the 70s, they started using quantitative scores. So that's a number. So there was a criterion reference point that they expected a child to reach by a certain time. Then we learned a lot about biomechanics in these years, and we started coming up with biomechanical descriptions of movement patterns in fundamental skill. So it wasn't a total loss. We did take away some knowledge, even though the theory was false. So right now I want you to use this maturational perspective. Pretend you're a 1930 scientist and you're trying to explain a toddler learning to walk, and then a child riding a bike, and a teenager having some difficulty swimming. So go ahead and pause the video and do these things, and we'll keep rolling in a sec. Now we're going to switch gears into the information processing perspective, and these scientists get a little bit closer. They're not quite there in what we know today in 2023. They are starting to think, some external factors do influence motor development. So they are thinking we can nurture an individual. So their basic tenets was the brain is a computer. Now, when you're on a computer, what you put in directly impacts an output. So the human brain must be a passive. So they thought all we need to do is stimulate this passive brain with the environment, and then we get a result. So the important concepts are, it's like inputting or coding, right? If you put a different stimulus, you'll get a different result. Kind of too far away from the nature. So, and they started this by young adults. It was their starting point. And then they looked at what became before in children and after in older adults. So they had to break down this. It's clearly too much. So they started talking about perceptual motor development. So they started picking up that some learning delays, can be identified with lapses in gross motor skill. But what's the problem with that? I'll give a brief example. My son's quite stubborn, and he has an older sister that's 5 years his older, and she would get in his face and tell him to do stuff, and he would straight up ignore her. So then when he was 4 and went to preschool, if he didn't want to do something, he straight up ignored his teacher. Now she thought he was having seizures. So there is a seizure disorder. It's not a grand mal seizure. It's these little partial seizures to where the person blanks. Okay? My son did not have a seizure disorder. He's stubborn. Okay? So what's the problem with this? Well, let's talk about science, okay? There's good science and bad science, and then some science that you just naturally get errors on. So let's look at the table. Look at the first column. Here's your conclusion. So if you don't see anything and look up, there's nothing there, you are right. But if you don't see something and there was something there, then it's a type 2 error. Type 1 error is when you see something, but there's nothing there. Okay, so this type 1 error would be like a false positive COVID test. Okay, so maybe you don't have COVID, but something happens, nothing in the test, maybe it's not perfect. Who knows, but let's say you don't have COVID and you test positive. That'd be a type 1 error. All right, let's talk about the opposite. Maybe you don't stick that thing in your nose long enough. Maybe you do have COVID, you're feeling sick, you go get tested, and they tell you, no, you don't have COVID, and they're wrong. That would be a type 2 error. So these are important, and these happen especially when we're talking about children and their development, because development is age-related, not age-determined. So let's think about the informational processing, and it's the same question. Now I want you to think as an information processing perspective. How would a toddler learn to walk, a child ride a bike, and how would you explain a teenager having difficulty swimming? These are the same 3 examples from before, but I want you to put on a different hat and think about it a different way. Okay, lastly, the ecological perspective. So this is what we talked about last week. We thought about a task, an environment, and an individual. And these are things that are interacting. So we do respect the neurological system. We agree it's part of the puzzle, but it's not everything. There's a lot going on. Okay? So the one thing that I want you to also keep in mind is there are 2 branches. There's a dynamic and a perception action, which we'll talk about. Okay, dynamic. So this theory came out of the 80s. It said the body systems are spontaneous, self-organized, not driven only by the central nervous system. Body symptoms, performers, environment all interact. So this was the example of jumping up on a desk. There are people that were like, no, I'm not doing it. And that's part personality. That's part because they don't want to jump in front of people. And it's that table wasn't safe. All these things. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about dynamic systems. Some systems develop slower while others speed up. Okay. So think about, you might have coordination but not strength. And this was characterized by the qualitative and discontinuous change. And this occurs across a lifespan. So here's some examples. Okay, so there's 4 systems to the left, and they move at different times. There might be development in some, others maybe not so much development. But look over to the right. All these systems come into play to expedite development. Okay, perception action. Oh, this was based off Gibson's work in the 60s and 70s. So it's important to note that that is a overlap between the different perspectives. The match-relational perspective people, they held on to it for a really long time. And you can see the other science just keeps getting better. We keep getting more descriptive. We keep thinking about other variables that we weren't before. So Gibson talked about affordance. This is the function of an environmental object and how it reacts to the individual. Okay, and I think the best way to get to this is the example of my son. When we moved to Delaware, he was 2. He had a new dresser. It was very tall, and it had round knobs for the drawer pulls. And he looked at this drawer, and he said, "A rock wall!" So in my son's head, he didn't see a dresser with clothes. He instantly saw something that he could climb. So the drawers, in my head, you know, you pull the knob, you get the clothes in. My son was thinking that knob is stationary. I put my hand on it, then my foot, and I climb up to the top of my dresser. So it really, seeing something, an object, it'd be the same object because my son and I were intrinsically different. We saw the dresser / rock wall in different lights. Okay, so let's talk about what these branches have in common. So both branches reject that the central nervous system is the be-all end-all. They think, both perspectives, that, you know, we have a distribution of development. This distribution is across multiple systems. This really challenged the perspective at the time, and it allowed for new ways of thinking and new experiments. Okay, so last time. So use this perspective, the ecological perspective, to explain a toddler walking, child riding a bike, and a teenager that has difficulty swimming. And that's pretty much it for the lecture. What we did is we talked about different perspectives. We talked about how each perspective was unique, but there was benefits. There's value in each one. And the match-relational perspective has long-lasting effects, even though we've learned a great deal since then. All right, remember, this week we're not going to be meeting. I unfortunately have some family business I need to attend to. I am going to post this lecture and 3 assignments. There's going to be an article review, and we have group number 2. We'll be reviewing that article. So you guys are going to get ready for them by completing the table and posting it on Blackboard. There's going to be a study guide and a quiz on Blackboard. Thank you, everybody.